Welcome to Rare Connection, the podcast dedicated to bridging the gap between rare disease patient, medical professionals, and the public. And the search for life, changing treatments. I'm your host, Joanna, and today I'm diving into a crucial topic: how advanced data and AI are transforming the way we find and support rare disease patients. For those living with rare disease, the journey to diagnosis and treatment is often long and filled with obstacles. Traditional medical records and diagnosis codes don't always tell the full story, making it difficult to identify patients, match them to clinical trials, and connect them with treatments they need. But what if technology could change that? Joining us today is Jeff McDonald, CEO of Kythera Labs, a company using advanced data analytics and AI to revolutionize the rare disease space. Jeff will help us understand how these technologies are helping find patients faster and improve clinical trials and speed up access to treatments. We'll also discuss how data-driven insights can empower patient advocacy and accelerate drug discovery. This is a conversation you won't want to miss. Let's get started. Why is it so difficult to identify rare disease patients in traditional healthcare systems?
Great question. It's a big problem for a lot of different reasons. I think, Joanna, one of the things I learned years ago, so I've been working in healthcare for about 30 years, and it kind of came from the provider side, working with health systems and pharmacy system companies and stuff over the years. And what I realized pretty early on was that the unique vocabulary that is healthcare is complex, to say the least, right? You could be someone working in the pharmacy space, a pharmacologist, pharmacist by background, and you're kind of trained in one language. There's some Latin and there's some proprietary naming conventions for drugs. There's coding standards for what represents a drug, whether it's the route description of what a drug is. And then you talk to a provider, a health system provider, a physician, a medical specialist, and they speak in problem lists that their patients present with. They code into electronic health record technologies primarily for the purpose of getting reimbursed for their time, unfortunately. But then they also take notes that kind of have more to do with the interaction with the patient. So if you just take that kind of basic front end of the process, you have technology that's capturing information for revenue and billing purposes. And then you have this unstructured set of data that's inside of these systems that is really about the provider and patient relationship and the dialogue. So you're crossing multiple language barriers in this process. You got coding standards that are specifically around, like the American Medical Association CPT codes. They're specifically designed to capture a procedure for the purpose of getting reimbursed for it, primarily. NDC codes for drugs, those are so that you can order the appropriate product to fulfill the patient. It has nothing to do with the scientific side. It's a totally different language. The scientist speaks from a biological perspective about mechanisms of action and their targets and proteins that they're after. very, very few physicians in the United States even speak that language on a regular basis. Sometimes they're very distant, depending on their specialty. So you've got two sides of an industry trying to focus on a patient in the middle, and it's literally like there's 15, 20 different languages being spoken. And you're trying to describe a patient's life and a patient's problems. And it's like one person speaking Latin, another person speaking French, another person is speaking Python, which is a programming language. Another person is speaking a coding standard. Another person is speaking in these scientific terms about, how energy is made inside of a cell. And so it's hard. I mean, that semantically, that large problem space of communication and crossing the silos of those dialects is very, very difficult to begin with. Never mind the actual problem patients might be living. So that's the starting point for a lot of it, is we're speaking in different languages.
So how do gaps in medical records and diagnosis codes impact clinical trials and access to treatment for rare disease patients?
Yeah. So, if we look at that, we say, okay, we have a code that represents a set of conditions. We'll, use it like take ulcerative colitis, or you take some digestive disorder like IBS. There's a set of diagnosis codes that kind of represent that patient's problems. But in order to understand the patients that have those problems, patients have these problems sometimes, well, almost always throughout time. So okay if I use kind of a personal example on this one. So I suffered with psoriasis for 30 years. Went to doctors. Generally, who you go to when you have some skin condition, right? You go to a dermatologist, or you go to your primary care doc, and they try something, and then they send you to the dermatologist when it doesn't work. So I went that route, and I was prescribed multiple different drugs. Many of those drugs just exacerbated the problem. So if that's happening on the front end, and I'm getting something that's making it worse, the question I asked myself was why? Why would medical professionals prescribe something that's going to make it worse? A lot of times it's because they're treating the symptom and not the underlying problem. And for me, the sad thing is I found out of a genetic mutation I had that affects my gut, therefore my ability to absorb and produce specific enzymes in appropriate amounts. Where when I changed my diet, in a matter of a few days, the psoriasis that I suffered with for over 30 years just went away. There's no way to get on a clinical trial for that. There's no way to tell the doctor you're prescribing something that's going to harm me, because they're practicing, they're trying best they know based upon the symptoms. So I'll take it back to that step. When I think about patients presenting, and I've seen, process technology wise, tens of billions of patient encounters. A lot of times the patient will show up with a problem that they want help with, and the doctor's only able to interpret how they help it based upon their medical experience and training. So if we have a patient showing up with a problem, and it's been multiple years or decades of that problem, medical professional needs to take a step back and say, maybe I'm a little too close to the forest and the trees situation, and maybe we need to think about there's an underlying cause here that we're not getting to the root of. So if I think through a patient that's had a condition that's going on for a long period of time, I think one of the most important things for patients to do on their own behalf is to seek out, there's a few organizations. I know one, NORD, that has a rare disease online website that helps people kind of sift through things. A lot of times you actually have to know what rare disease you have before you know how to get on the registry. But the point there is that there are many drugs in development that, from a safety efficacy perspective, it's even often difficult for a physician to prescribe a new treatment that is not, doesn't have therapeutic evidence that it will affect or improve that particular outcome benefit. once someone is diagnosed with a rare disease, that we do have mechanisms today where people can try alternative methods of treatment that, legally weren't allowed 10 years, 15 years ago. So I think one of the benefits here is we're starting to recognize that there's different ways to approach problems with a, I'll say drug development or clinical development mindset versus what may have been only approved drugs that are in available on a shelf somewhere. So right now, it's really critical that folks begin to understand if you're living with a condition for a long period of time, sometimes we're not really dealing with the underlying problem, which is representative in a different language, our biology. So that's an important, what I'll say, self-advocacy thing that I've personally lived through. And I think people that are dealing with that often, we have to become our own best physicians. We have to do a lot of our own research. And I think that's a healthy thing. It's important to be responsible as best we can to find alternatives.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the biggest barriers rare disease patients face when trying to enroll in clinical trials?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Do you want to know what it's really like to have a C-section? I'm Dr. Jen, an obstetric anesthesiologist.
And I'm Bethany, a nurse and a birth educator.
This is the C-Section Experience podcast, where we support you in preparing for and processing your C-section journey through education, validation, and storytelling. We're here to reduce anxiety, amplify your voice, and help you feel truly seen.
As friends and fellow C-section mamas, we're on a mission to empower you. Through personal stories and expert guests, we'll laugh, we'll cry, feel all the feels, so you can approach your birth with confidence.
Well, the clinical trial landscape is complex. If we look at, I think over the next 3 to 5 years, over 50% of all of the disease trials are in oncology. So oncology is way over indexed as a percentage of all of the investment dollars and research going on. That's one thing to be very thoughtful of. Second thing is, realistically, is if you look at what is listed on the FDA's website of the trials, which we do, it's not necessarily consumer friendly. I'll say that. You have to kind of be a little bit of a scientist or physician to understand some of it. But finding a physician that works in an organization or at an organization that is intimately familiar with clinical trials is very important. Mostly the academic medical centers are the top of the list. Not always, but that's generally the case. And then children's hospitals obviously have a lot of their own work. But you really need to have someone that is an advocate for you with a clinical background or physician background that can look at what's available in the clinical trials to kind of evaluate. But the patient's responsibility is to potentially advocate for that if they think it's really a requirement, because of the nature and the complexity of trying to figure out what trial might map to your underlying condition or issue. So I think that's an important part of the equation as well, is to know who's where, who's who in the zoo. I use that a lot. Is like, just because there's a doctor down the street and a hospital down the street doesn't mean that hospital down the street does anything to do with trials or clinical research. Principal investigators must not be present for hundreds of miles around. I live in rural Tennessee. I've got to drive 60 miles to get to where there might be a PI to do any kind of trial. So it's also
not uncommon in the refugee space.
Yep.
That's really not uncommon, especially on the West Coast.
Yeah.
Most of the doctors are back somewhere.
Look at the size of our country. A huge percentage of our population lives in small towns. And we're spread out by hundreds or thousands of miles where, if you had to get the density of a New York City or an LA, it's, you would take 15 states to do that. That is a logistics challenge for clinical trials as well. There literally is a logistics problem. There's got to be a physical location in most cases. There was something you mentioned before. If it's okay, I just want to go back to gaps in medical records. So with physicians doing encounters in America, right, a physician, depending on their specialty, they often don't have a lot of time to do coding, right? And the coding that they're doing, again, is kind of fitting the purpose of getting paid for their encounter, which is clear. When we look at patients and problems that exist with finding patients with rare diseases, the real tricky part about registries is that we have to actually extract information from the value, which is in the notes that that physician may have taken. They might have transcribed it after the appointment. They might do real-time transcription. Those codes don't map to diagnosis codes. Generally, they map to another terminology concepts called SNOMED. And those clinical terminologies are a lot more verbose. They have a tendency to kind of put their finger on underlying representations of diseases or clusters of symptoms that are similar to a rare disease. And that's kind of the connection point to the possibility of being qualified to meet the criteria for a trial. And so I was literally at a healthcare IT conference last week in Las Vegas. Not my favorite place, but I was there for the conference. And I was talking to an analytics senior executive analytics for a large health system in the West. And he said, this is one of their number one problems. They have to sift through potentially thousands of clinical notes, charts, to look for patients with specific conditions. One of them was a pulmonary registry they were working on. And they can't afford the number of people that they need to go through all those charts to find the patients that match the correct. And why? Because the healthcare costs are so high, the expenses. This health system had 2% margin on all of their patient encounters, surgeries, everything. So they couldn't afford additional administrative staff to pay for people to go through the documents in the repos of data to find patients that match the trial. So, you've got a human capacity problem, you've got a translational problem, and then you've got I'll call it the targeting problem, which is you actually have to have the clinical experience to read the chart and say, this is close to the criteria for this particular trial. You have to interpret the design of that trial as does this person meet those inclusion and exclusion criteria. That takes someone with very specific skills. So now, if you look at that, now there's just one more confounding area upstream in the process that could be a huge constraint for a patient that's really trying to get the care they need and try something new versus what the health system challenge might be, the provider's challenge, which is not having the staff to do the administrative work. But that's where things actually start to get exciting when you start to think about the technology.
So, how is AI advanced data? How is AI and advanced data analytics changing the way rare disease patients are identified?
And that's where the excitement comes in. So, we humans often have challenges. I'm just speaking for myself. I have attention deficit disorder, I think. I was probably born with that one. But the ability to listen to a person in a setting, like a clinical setting, where you have time constraints. You have to see so many patients per day. Quite often, during that patient that has a rare disease, the ability to sift through everything they're saying, put a model in their minds around the problem that they're dealing with is incredibly complex. And I've heard it said that some of the best physicians can process about 50 variables when they're looking at the symptoms and patterns of the symptoms to try to match it to a diagnosis. That's a lot of math. I mean, computation, 50 variables is a lot. The power of what AI, and let me make sure I'm not kind of overfitting or over-indexing on this term, artificial intelligence. Let me just break it into a few key parts for understanding. There are very specific methods from a computer science and mathematics perspective that we have attributed to this term AI. One of them is an area of probability theory, something called transformers, where when I have incomplete information, a model can predict the missing information. Let's transform. Those have been around for a few years now that have been popularized by Google and a few other research organizations, but have been put into practice. We see something very, very simple version of that. We go on the web, we start typing the browser, and it types ahead, kind of tells you what you might be. That's an minor example of a transformer. In clinical terms, the power of this is when fed lots of historical content and medical literature, the ability to see a pattern of what's available in data with something that's referenced in medical literature is the power that computers have. And mathematically, they have it because we can train up via large corpuses on the ability to spot the pattern recognition, even if the words are slightly out of sequence, because the underlying meaning is similar. That's the excitement. This is where the excitement comes from. I'm not saying there's a lot of companies that have failed at this miserably. They fall into a trap where things are not what's called generalizable, meaning, well, it worked in this one condition, but when I pointed it at this other condition, it broke, right? That's a failure mode of technology that happens when we make fragile systems. So the promise, though, is an ability to create those rapid ability to recognize the patterns, whether it's of the symptoms and the problems or some kind of history in response to treatment, lab values, fill in the blanks, lots and lots of different things that these models, trained models, small models, have an ability to do to recognize between all of the different domains of science, mathematics, and as well as, the clinical experience that physicians have. There's definitely traps, but there is excitement. We specifically see our ability to extract or abstract from documents the salient points that describe what a patient is dealing with. And we're having tremendous success in that area. So I get excited when I hear that specific problem, because I know that we're closer than ever to making that more generalized at scale. It requires a lot of, we call ourselves a lot of times at Kythera like the blue collar workers of data, because we spend a lot of time curating and getting the quality correct for the purpose. So that is critical. It's not like it's a secret weapon or, a silver bullet, I guess is probably a better term. It's nothing like that. It's a series of methods that have tremendous promise because they can do things that would ordinarily take dozens or hundreds of people to do in a fraction of the time. That's what creates the real opportunity, I think, for everyone. It's that you can afford to do things that you might not have been able to afford prior.
Can you explain how Kythera Labs technology works and how it helps rare disease patients?
Yeah, so I probably should have my CTO and all my smart people tell how our technology works. I'll give you the layman's terms. So I'm not a programmer. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I'm far from that. I have a design background. So to put it simply, the way we've designed our technology is first and foremost is to create a simplified and unified integrated data model. Right? So we have an ability to connect massive sets of different types of data across multiple data types in a method that is more natural to the way a patient receives care. It's longitudinal. It's not the way like an EMR is represented in a database. It's more linear. It's like Jeff went here, he went here. He had this done, he had this done, this done, this done. We've designed our data and our technology to create data. And then what that does is it allows for new domains of data or intelligence, you might say, to be applied to that or augment that. So as an example, if we were to use big thing right now in industry is the whole use of GLP-1s for obesity and diabetes and heart. So Kythera is able to augment a lot of this patient historical data that we have in ways to look at the underlying biology, what's called omics. So all these different disciplines of data to patients to kind of look for patterns of similarity. We're all unique. That's the powerful thing about how we've been designed and how we function as humans. We're all unique, but we are similar in many ways. And the power of what we've done in technology is to create the similarity models for patients, even though they can be disparate in their backgrounds, their education, where they live. They might have very similar representations in their biomarker. We want to make it easy to see the segmentation of these populations in very ways, which is really important in rare disease. Because if you're going to bring together, 100,000, 50,000 patients total with a given rare disease, you need to be able to connect them to time and look at how similarly they may have responded to treatment. How similarly they were treated by the healthcare systems that have allopathic design of treatment that are very siloed in their own nature. We can now bring to bear kind of these additional layers of data to see the patient behavior. And that's a really important piece to the equation, is our technology makes that easier for people to implement and use without having to be multi-domain experts across all these different things. Really simplified.
Are there any examples of success stories where AI has helped speed up diagnosis and or access to treatment?
So I think one area, because we're not directly in the treatment side of things, we have an organization working on specifically in the ulcerative colitis space, and they had a very specific need to find patients that would potentially meet the criteria for a specific clinical trial. And what it allowed them to do was to see kind of a different pattern to the way patients were being treated in that space that created great promise for a molecule, right? Something that's being designed by a scientist somewhere to address an underlying problem and that mechanism of the disease. And so it's exciting for us to realize that there was tens of millions of dollars of kind of validation that they should continue with that drug discovery pathway. While at another time they saw another target and they realized this is going to fail miserably. There's no way we're going to make this work. So they could reallocate their capital to the area. So that's generally where Kythera plays, is we have an ability to kind of look upstream in the research side and where people are trying to put investments on these rare and ultra rare diseases, or areas of unmet need in existing major conditions. There's often only so much capital to go around, and if you make them more effective with the use of their capital and how they target those conditions, it often translates into the benefits for a lot more people, because if they didn't waste $100 million developing something that failed, then they could put that to work in another area. But generally speaking, that's a really good thing for everyone. So that's really our focus is to help those organizations. And likewise, on the provider side, our ability to help with our technology streamline the process to get people onto a registry that need to be. I'd say that's the other side of the equation that we're really excited about helping. That's pretty new for us. We've been working on this for a while. We started with the kind of the scientific and the bench side for the pharma and biotech first, and now we're bringing it back to our provider customer base to show them that they have a similar opportunity to kind of do more with less and treat patients and bring patients to new treatments with a lot less effort. Right? Maybe a lot less people slipping through the gaps. So that's also critical.
How do you platform? How does your platform improve the efficacy, the efficiency and success of clinical trials?
So it's indirect, it's not directly. So we're not involved in the clinical trials, but indirectly our ability to do the data preparation for all of the real world data that's part of that trial design is really where we step in and where our technology does things. I think that the biggest area, we were a startup, we still are in a way, right? We're in growth stage of our company, and we always had to be very efficient in capital. We had to be able to do things with very small teams to be effective. And what we've seen is that a lot of our clients have that same problem. Pharma and biotech markets been hurt pretty badly over the last few years in terms of the economics of certain policies. So as a result, they're trying to do a lot more with less. They have to really tighten their bootstraps. So because we've always been capital efficient, we have an ability to help them through the efficiencies we've created in data technology, data integration technology, which ultimately leads them to be able to either do more trials or move faster through the process. We're not the clinicians. We're the data junkies. We're the data engineers and data scientists. So as a result, we're very much in support of what they do. We can't do what they do, and our job has always been, why we exist is to reduce the uncertainty in the use of real world data, and the way we do that is with technology that we've created purpose-built. So the approach there is to continually to drive efficiencies and throughput. Right, at the end of the day, that's how you measure it. If you can do more faster, smaller teams, they're going to be more successful. Unfortunately, a lot of the scientific stuff requires failing. A lot of the trials don't fail because of the complexity. And potentially, I'd say there's probably some other things that we would love to be able to help on. Is that trial design by its nature is somewhat flawed, and with rare disease, I think there's an opportunity here to kind of rethink that. It's an area that we hope we can get some influence in. It's this whole concept around, the clinical trial design has, a very specific need for, types of controls. And again, this is way over my pay grade. I'm not a scientist, but where the iterative process of developing a drug in trials often yields very valuable fruit. But that would make a trial fail. Trial can't fail suddenly, or the whole thing gets scrapped. You got to start all over. And I think some of the power of real world data is that you can do more iterations in the real world data with patients in less risky areas, and potentially build like a cluster of therapies as opposed to a single one that met the criteria. There's just too small of a population for clinical trials in many cases to exist effectively. And that's an area of opportunity for change that we think folks need to really take a hard look at the FDA and other places to see if there's alternative paths forward for all, for new treatments.
So, how can AI impact AI? How can AI and data analytics help pharmaceutical companies develop rare disease treatments faster?
Yeah, I think that a little bit of where I was, just talking about that is when we look through the target opportunity for patients with rare diseases. If you just took the number of people in the United States with rare diseases and the size of the samples, to be able to do more of the trial, leveraging real world data, leveraging the actual simulations and data, I think it's a pretty dramatic departure from the methods that are currently being done. But ultimately, those are areas to drive down the cost, increase the speed, use simulation technologies, and what I'll say less risky alternatives to large clinical trial strategies. I think that's probably the biggest area of opportunity for pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies to make changes. But there needs to be change in policy in order for that to occur. It requires a willingness for real world evidence to be generated in a different way than the current methods for large scale clinical trials in order.
Are there any promising trends or breakthroughs in how AI is shaping drug discovery for rare diseases?
Well, that's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I do hear, we do watch, there's a lot of areas where folks are, very much purpose designing molecules purpose built for a variety of targets, and they can do so faster. Plus the ability to do gene editing, again, way out of my pay grade, but all of these areas are things that are pretty hot topics these days. Conferences that I've been at recently, some of these rare diseases require, new products to be created that have never even been created before. Instead of using transplants, actually growing, skin grafts, growing all kinds of different valves and parts of our bodies. It's a pretty hot topic. A lot of times the rare diseases affect us physically in ways, and they're not just always therapy. I know there's quite a bit of activity from a conference I was at last week in that space alone, where if we could grow tissues that replace heart valves for people, with children that have, very specific valve disorders and rare diseases, that's a game changer in that space, because you just don't have enough transplant patients, and some of the artificial valves don't hold up as well. So there's a whole new branch that folks are working on that I think is very promising. Ultimately, if you could prevent disease, that would be even more promising. And a lot of the personalized medicine area, I believe, is in a very nascent state right now. It's exciting that personalized medicine, because of many of the techniques with real world data, have tremendous opportunity in the coming 10, 15 years to change a lot of what folks live with chronic and long-term debilitating diseases. There's a lot of promise in that space.
Since the majority of the rare diseases are genetic, if without genetic coding, that would be pretty difficult to prevent.
Well, the thing that's interesting about it is it's funny, I was having a discussion with our chief science officer the other day, and there's areas where, just like for me, I have a genetic mutation, a very specific, methylation process that can lead to all kinds of challenges. We can have genetic disorders, but we can also change a lot of the expression of that genetic disorder in ways that quite often we have not done a lot of testing of. The expression of the gene is, and how it shows up in our body can often be exacerbated by other underlying conditions that could be treated much more easily and would reduce the impact of that genetic disorder. Those are exciting areas to me. That's the power of the human body to heal, to adapt. It's incredible how it does it. And I think that's an area where, just because there's a genetic mutation in a given area, we have a genetic, quote, air quotes, defect, it doesn't mean that our life is going to be the same going forward if we can stimulate the body to respond and adapt to that. My dad had a situation from a heart condition that he had, and his body grew another pathway to get around a blocked artery. And I'm like, what? And the surgeon's like, oh yeah, we see it all the time. And it's like, sometimes we don't think about that adaptive ability. Well, gets exciting. That gets exciting when a variety of different underlying biological processes could be triggered to help the body adapt. And we haven't really thought about unlocking that. Not just pure medically or therapeutically, but at the underlying function of the body can often be stimulated. Cells in cancer is very common, but stem cells, the promise of stem cells in a variety of areas have potential tremendous promise. I think we're just barely scratching the surface there. So those are times where, even though we're born genetic abnormalities, it doesn't mean there's not a way for us, our bodies, to adapt and get stronger. So hopeful for that.
Yeah, CRISPR's the one you hear a lot about these days.
Absolutely. It scares me, quite frankly. I'm worried what we're going to see in horror movies. Never mind, what happens if we make a mistake. But again, I'm not the scientist that they'll give me the keys to that car. I'll leave that to the smarter people.
Yeah. So I have a rare genetic condition myself. It's a metabolic condition called homocystinuria, and that one is one they're experimenting with, but probably pretty far down the line, unless they do with being tested in rats for CRISPR. But it's way far down the line. But I am in a clinical trial right now. Which fair.
It's a fascinating area. Metabolic. We all have some form of metabolic compromise throughout our lives. It's just sometimes it can be extreme and expressed really strongly. And we have, like, for me, the MTHFR has a metabolic implication because of methylation. Fortunately, I can adapt to. What's it?
MTHFR, the severe form of MTHFR is a form of my condition.
Yep.
So I have homocystinuria, so it's.
Yep. Not easy. Not easy for sure. That need for that cycle to function properly is, we often take it for granted, you know.
And they just got their first research grant, so they're doing stuff with it. What role does real world data play in expanding treatment options for patients?
You know, I think one of the challenges with it is that, you know, it kind of goes back to medical disciplines, right? A lot of times, so I'm held together with duct tape and chewing gum. So I was an athlete for a lot of years, so I've had a lot of surgeries on it. And certain disciplines of medicine can often be dismissive of other branches of medicine. My personal favorite form of clinician is a physical therapist because of my sports injury. But the orthopedic surgeon often gets all the notice. When we're dealing with complex conditions and diseases, this is where I think it takes a team. It takes a full complement and healthy industry of, skilled professionals to help patients get the most out of their lives, even with condition. And I would love to see what I'd say a less siloed and more well-aligned incentive industry, right? An industry that really is thinking about the patient first. Because I think that's really true. And one of my concerns is always, like, if you have misaligned incentives, it's kind of like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it's not really good analogy when it comes to patients and patient lives. I think we have a lot of that, unfortunately, in America right now. I'm not saying we blow up the system. Not what I mean. I just think that there's a need to be more open-minded and think about many different ways to approach disease and chronic disease management. Because quite often the outcomes research and outcome studies that so many people talk about isn't necessarily it's not necessarily in the best interest of the patient. Quite often I've heard patients that they want their pain to go away so they can live their lives. They want to be able to go on a walk. Like their outcomes are not the outcomes measures the trial requires, or the scientist wants, or the orthopedic surgeon wants, or the medical device supplier wants. There's a need to kind of be more thoughtful about outcomes and what does an outcome mean for the patient. Because quite frankly, I've seen for my own life, I've changed massive things about my diet that have made incredible difference in my body's ability to deal with inflammation, which has affected my immune response. So I'm healthier, I get sick less. And also helped me with, retaining unwanted weight as I get older. So that required a massive dietary change that most dietitians have never read. That's the part where I want to see the data support the opportunity. What if we all were scientists? And what I mean is, what if we were all collecting our own data? What if we all contributed our data to others that needed data because they're trying to solve a similar? What we do is we spot more patterns. And it's simple things. Sometimes it's, here's what happens after I eat this food. This is what happened. I was taking magnesium and I found that I slept better. And as a result, such and such was expressing that. Sometimes it's that simple. But unfortunately, because of incentives in our industry, it's like, yeah, but that doesn't make anyone any money. It's like, well, quite frankly, I don't care. It's the right thing to do. Okay. So I'm a little altruistic. Is a man considered crazy because he sees things as they want to be or as he wants to see them rather than as they merely are? That's, to me, that's the thing about healthcare, why I'm still doing it after 30 years, is because there's a different way for us to look at the challenges that patients deal with. And it's incumbent upon us to drive to that future, to, even if it's uncomfortable, even if financially it's not necessarily in my best interest, I should still do it anyway. So that's my soapbox speech.
How can rare disease patients and advocacy groups benefit from data-driven insights?
Yeah, one aspect of it is kind of what I was alluding to. Someone asked me, would you be willing to contribute your own data for research? And I'd say in a heartbeat. Now, I want protections on that data. It can't be used against me. But I think one of the aspects of rare disease especially is there's so much data outside of the electronic health record building systems and even the tests that's really important that researchers understand. And if advocacy groups and patients that are in those situations are willing to contribute to what I'll say is the corpus of data available, that's one of the most important things. Again, full protection for those people's data. It's, they're contributing because they want to make a difference. I think that's the facet. A lot of times stuff even locked into electronic health records is insufficient to get to really the outcome that we might all be looking for. So that's where there's a more open standard approach to this problem that requires us all kind of looking at how can we contribute, how can we help as potentially the people that are also suffering. I don't want to make it onerous, but there needs to be a way to be part of that. I know most people on registries that's exactly what they're signing up for, is to be part of the solution. The promise of, so I wear a ring, right, to monitor my sleep and monitor all my motion and everything else. I think data like that is incredibly valuable. And there's more sensors coming all the time that could be breakthroughs for certain conditions. So that's probably my desire, is how do we create a way for it to be shared safely and linked, and even give the patient approval rights to share it to different professionals that could research it. That's just kind of, that's like, for me, nirvana. That's like, wow, if we built a system where the patients can contribute directly and control it, that's a way for us all to kind of give back and pay it forward.
So what can patients do to ensure that data is being used effectively to improve research and treatment access?
Good question. I don't know if I have a really good answer to that, other than folks that are part of registries are pretty much signing up to have their data be available. That's probably the one. There's probably some areas of research that might take a look at some of the regulatory stuff, but that's outside the patient's hands. I don't know if I have a good answer for you there.
How do you see AI and data shaping the future of rare disease care in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think it's that, especially with certain types of use of the AI methods that I talked about, I think that we will see some pattern recognition and some visibility in certain conditions and ways in the next 5 years, 10 years that we haven't been able to see before because of how data has been highly siloed. So I think that's one area it's coming in very, very quickly. But even, the ability to move the scientific research closer to the bedside, closer to the patient, unobtrusively, is an area for potential massive breakthrough, which is, think about it when a doctor's asking about the symptoms and problems, to translate that language of those problems directly into what the equivalent might express in a biomarker or express, in the underlying biology. Those are areas where I have tremendous excitement around. And it's because we're bridging the chasm of these technological problems and really we're working with a few companies right now that actually have biomarker data. They actually have blood samples for very specific conditions. And we're able to tie it right from the bedside directly to the researcher working. That's a massive area of opportunity. To shrink the time and effort to establish the value in the data that comes from those samples is a tremendous opportunity. So that's an area of great excitement.
How do you balance the need for patient data with concerns about privacy and consent?
Yeah, I was alluding to that before. For us, obviously, we use a third party to disintermediate that risk and to certify that we're complying with the law, but not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, which is we don't want any data that we're working on bringing to the market through partnerships that we have to ever be able to violate the rights of the individual. The whole concept of fair data platform is big for us. But it's why does that matter? I think HIPAA was originally established to prevent people from potentially losing their right to receive a healthcare plan or coverage because of past medical history. But now what we're finding is that same law that was put in place can often prevent the connecting of that data to new and novel sources because it creates a new risk. So I think the area right in that particular space, that's an area that needs to be looked at from a consent perspective of the patient, potentially rewritten so we're protecting the patient but also accelerating the research. It's a fine line. I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on TV. It's a complex area to balance those. It's a big part of health tech. You require, and even running a business, you require segregation of duties. That's essential. You need governing bodies. You need people overseeing the industry. At the same time, sometimes you have to look at the risks and think through potentially a different way to adapt to the risk. Example would be we can build synthetic data for clinical trials and research on purely synthetic data, meaning we completely removed any possibility someone could re-identify the patient. That's an area of breakthrough, but it's going to require that anyone that has to create real evidence to submit to governing body or to the FDA, they have they've been given the rights to do. It's sufficient enough for that trial. That's an area where we could actually remove one of the bottlenecks by changing what's allowed to be submitted for evidence. Again, there's a balancing act here. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of constituents, but I think that's an additional way where we can really protect the individual patient. Use the data for its purpose, but prevent it from being used against the patient.
What safeguards are in place to ensure ethical use of AI in rare disease research?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest area is the principle of expert determination. So when we amass a lot of data about patients across the United States that have very specific conditions, whether they're rare or not, we must meet a criteria, which is a less than 1% risk of likelihood of re-identification. That the balance of financial risk and because of the liabilities if it does happen, but it's also because you're really trying to reduce the likelihood that someone could fairly use that data. So I think that's a critical thing that's in place, and all of us that work in the industry know we have to live up to that. Quite frankly, a lot of times we make it even far more difficult than the 1% risk that the government requires. That's just something I think everyone should know. registries are a little different because they're really brokered through the provider. The caregiver is the person that can allow for the data to be used for different purposes. But folks in the real world data industry, where we're dealing with de-identified data, we have very specific regs that we have to comply with and be attested to, on an annual or quarterly basis. So that's a reassurance I think patients should know. Not like their data is being sold with their social security number and house and phone number on it. That's not the case in the industry.
What advice would you give to rare disease patients who feel lost in the system?
It's hard. I think, advocacy, are you familiar with NORD by any chance?
Yes, I'm very familiar with them.
So, I kind of look at organizations like that. I don't, the internet's a powerful thing, reach out, try to find organizations like them. I think that's really where my best advice, because I'm not personally connected to my disease isn't rare. Mine's pretty common. And so I know I can get a lot of help from a lot of different sources, whether they be online, friends, and so forth. That's kind of where I started. But the rare disease space, you can feel isolated and violent. So I think advocacy definitely begins with an organization that this is their world, this is what they live in. So that would be my first recommendation. And I think the other thing is understanding how the body works. The biology is, not the 401 level class or the PhD class, but some of the basic things that are going on in our body. I love drawings. Like when we find out that we have a problem in a certain aspect of our digestion or metabolic process. For me, the picture's empowering. I can actually understand what my body's doing or what it's not doing effectively. So, I think that knowledge is power. People dealing with this, if they use that pain and the challenge for the good to make themselves smarter about it, potentially leverage family members and other people that might be helpful. It's just a healthy thing. Our minds are powerful. What we can do with our minds, whether it be, living through pain or suppressing it or being able to cope with it better. That's one aspect, but it's incredible when our mind has a picture of what's going on in our body. We think about it. We can control our respiration. We can control our heart rates. It's incredible that we can do those things. Involuntary actions can be controlled voluntarily. What else? What else is possible? So I think the advocacy piece, being surrounded by people, but also maybe learning a little bit about what's technically going on, is always a good thing. I've heard of so many people that are in the profession they're in because as a child they had cancer. Now they're an oncologist, or just amazing things. So that's kind of a big thing for me. How do you give back from what you're suffering with to others? Quite often that's a healing event in itself.
Mm. How can listeners, whether they're patients, caregivers, or healthcare professionals, get involved in and benefit from the work Kythera Labs is doing?
Yeah, one thing, like the providers, I've been really enjoying working with a lot of providers. Like a lot of times, if providers are dealing with technical data challenges, and they're dealing with areas or domains of patients that have what I'd say real high unmet needs or underserved needs, those are organizations we can often help connect the dots. That's a big part of what we do. So whether it's connecting physicians to other physicians for relationships, that's often really important. But likewise is the underlying data that they sit on top of can be valuable for research purposes. And quite often it's not their core business, so we can help. That's a big piece of both. I would say on the life sciences biotech side, we're quite often working with companies early stage in their thesis where they're trying to understand the size and scope of an unmet need. I think that's another area we enjoy doing as well. It's it's quite often difficult for the biotech companies that are working on, new and emergent therapies to really have the staff and teams to process and to get access to data that they need for the early stage development of their business. Those are the two big things that I think reaching out to us on our website or via LinkedIn is something that we enjoy. Sometimes we might not have something directly or specifically to help them with, but quite often through our network and friends and family, we can be helpful to a lot of those organizations.
Where can people learn more about Kythera Labs and stay up to date, stay updated on your work?
So we do have a variety of podcasts for those that are on LinkedIn. There's quite a bit of content we publish regularly. See, pretty much all of our employees are on LinkedIn and can find us there, whether it's our Chief Science Officer, Glenn Dennis, or our CTO, Matt Ryan, or Chief Analytics Officer, Ryan Lord. Like, we have different skills and backgrounds. We're kind of an eclectic bunch. So we're aerospace engineers and designers and material science PhDs and statisticians. We're just a very eclectic bunch. You can follow us individually. There's a lot we publish. Also at conferences, we attend Biotech X and a variety of the big healthcare on the pharma side industry events and provider healthcare IT events. We're also very active with our technology partners, with DataVant, a few other big supplier organizations that we work with, but also on the Databricks technology platform. So we're a big tech partner of theirs. So you can also find us directly there if folks are working with their technology. We have a tendency to post quite a bit, pretty active there, because our tech choices really matter for the problems that we solve. So that's also another way for, depending on how folks found this podcast, can find us that. I think we probably also have links to my email or our marketing director that can connect us as well if anyone ever wants to reach out.
Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing how data and AI are transforming the rare disease space. The work you are doing at Kythera Labs is truly making a difference in helping patients to get diagnosed faster, access clinical trials, and find treatments they need.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
And to all of you who's listening or watching, thank you for being part of this conversation. If you enjoy today's episode, be sure to subscribe to my podcast, Rare Connection, and my YouTube channel, Rare Chef. If you are watching YouTube channel on YouTube, you can comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you are listening to the audio version, you can click on to send me a text link in the show notes to share your feedback. You can also follow Rare Connection on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn. There's a Facebook group and a page also to stay updated on future episodes and conversations. And if so, and if you'd like to support the show, you can find the support the show link in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, stay connected and keep advocating.
Take care. Thanks, Jimmy.